For more on this now, we're going to debate with China reporter and the author of Beijing Rules, Bethany Allen, and the author of The Coming Collapse of China, and China is going to war, Gordon Chang. Both of you, thank you. Bethany, I'll come to you first. I hope you were listening to those comments there by Ian Duncan Smith. Obviously, we're coming at this from a sort of British viewpoint. You're based in the US. You've got a lot of expertise covering China, especially from Taiwan. When you hear all of this, do you think there is any point for the UK to have a relationship with China?
Well, look, I think what we're really debating here isn't engagement. Governments talk to other governments. The world can't function well if that doesn't happen. The problem is that previous government policy has given engagement a bad name. In the past, engagement was synonymous with naivete, with giving up on key democratic values and interests without getting anything in return. This was engagement from a position of weakness, and that is what Britain had, that's what Germany had, that's what the US had, this belief that we had to give things up simply to get a meeting, that getting a meeting was enough of a takeaway, and that we didn't really expect anything in return. And if China promised something, we didn't check up on it. We just believed them. That's a position of weakness. But engagement, talking with Chinese government leaders from a position of strength can be a powerful tool. And just think about it. That's why the Chinese government pushes for it in the first place. They always want to talk with people because they do it from a position of strength, knowing that they are not going to back down on their own core interests, and knowing that they can walk away from a meeting if they need to or if they want to. And I think what Britain's mistake has been with China is too often approaching China alone. And I think that that's something that Boris Johnson began to improve on, and I think that Rishi Sunak can improve on this, understanding that when Cleverly goes to China, if Sunak meets with Xi Jinping next week in India at the G20, that they aren't alone, that they have a growing number of like-minded democratic partners and allies on their side who can help back up their demands, back up their statements, and back up our own democratic interests. I mean, engagement can be a powerful tool, and it can also be a powerful tool to prevent the absolute worst case scenario, which is miscalculation, misunderstanding resulting in a military conflict. And as our governments don't talk to one another, the risk of something like that happening gets higher and higher.
Absolutely. That's why, this debate about dialogue is happening, because if you don't, the results can be absolutely catastrophic. I just want to bring Gordon into this. And Gordon, you've been listening in as well. And Ian was listing out a series of threats he sees, not only to us here in the United Kingdom, but other allied countries as well. How big a threat do you think China is to the West?
China is an existential threat to the West. Xi Jinping has been propagating this notion that China is the world's only sovereign state. You just go on from there. The problem is that when Cleverly goes to Beijing, the Chinese are going to view it as Britain acknowledging its supplicant status. And that's what they do with American officials. The Biden administration has sent 4 senior officials to China without a return visit from a Chinese official to Washington. So the Chinese say, well, look, this is like imperial times where the vassals come and they acknowledge their subordinate status. And I think that, engagement sounds like it should work. We've been trying it for 5 decades. It's just created this horrible situation. We got to try something new, because if we don't try something new, things are just going to get worse. Now, I'm not saying that something new is going to be better, but at least it guarantees us, or at least it gives us the possibility of success, whereas engagement has totally failed.
So what other alternative way are you proposing?
Well, first of all, we're not going to send anybody to Beijing. If China wants to talk to us, they've got to come to Washington. And also, I think that if we don't talk, China has this policy of not talking to Americans, for instance. Well, why don't we adopt the same thing? Just not talk to them. Let them get scared for a while. But also, I believe we need to decouple from China. China is closing itself off from the world. Xi Jinping is engaging in some very belligerent behavior. I think that, as Ian Duncan Smith said, the Chinese economy is tumbling down. That makes Xi Jinping, I think, acting in ways which will be reckless. So we now need to change our emphasis from talking to China to starting to defend ourselves from China.
Bethany, just bring you in on that, the idea of decoupling and maybe just saying, look, if you want to speak to us, come to DC. Does that work?
Well, I don't think that works either. And to be clear, I think it's incredibly important that any kind of conversations, any kind of so-called engagement has to come with tough actions. And that's something that we are seeing from the Biden administration and that they're building on from the Trump administration. And that's something that increasingly we've seen from Britain. Although I will say in Britain's case, what we've had, I think, is a bad relationship with China. But as Ian laid out, not many actual strong moves to support democratic values. And so I think that there's an opening here for Sunak, to have a tougher policy on China and also talk to the Chinese and also go to Beijing, as cleverly as going to Beijing. But to your question, Rosanna, about decoupling, look. We don't want full decoupling. That's not possible. Economic decoupling is not possible. It would cause, vast poverty around the world, and it would greatly increase the risk of a military conflict between China and democratic nations. However, I am strongly supportive of the idea of a selective decoupling to promote democratic values. So decoupling from companies that are deeply complicit in China's authoritarian and totalitarian state, and also selective decoupling to promote national security interests, as the UK banned Huawei from its sensitive telecommunications networks. Great idea. And I also think something we haven't done that we need to is increasingly use selective decoupling to promote human rights. This is something that we have actually done very little of, with the exception of sanctioning some individuals, which is symbolic but has no real world effect.
Bethany, Gordon, Ian, thank you very much for your time.